Good afternoon everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. I'm doing some voiceovers in a row for a few videos, so if you've watched the last 2, then I will be sitting in exactly the same spot, except the sun keeps getting lower and I can't even see the screen anymore, so hopefully I'm still fairly centered in the frame, and the halo is there, isn't it, because the sun's behind me, but anyway, that's life. So the videos that I'm doing at the moment, I'm trying to run in order the videos of things that I've done just in the lead up to the 6-week grocery haul and just afterwards, and then we'll move into the videos of the food prep and preparation, and preservation and things like that. But I wanted to get these few videos out beforehand because they have things that are being made that are going to be relevant to the videos where I'm doing the food prep and preservation, because there'll be items that I would use for those things. So I didn't want to start the videos of the food preservation and the planning and the meals and all that and then have these other items out of place a little bit, like have these other items where I was showing them in the food stuff that I was doing, but you were going, but she hasn't made that yet. I didn't want it out of order, I wanted it all in order. So that's what we're doing at the moment. So I've got one more video of stuff that I've made before starting the actual preservation, meal prep, planning and all that post the 6-week grocery haul, and that one is loaded potato soup. Now I did put a photo of this up on Instagram and Facebook and everyone asked me about it too, so that's definitely the other reason. And the reason I made this was because when we got the food hamper, we got a lot of potatoes, and I already had quite a few potatoes left from the previous grocery haul, so I wanted to get some of them used. Loaded potato soup is one of my favorite things to can. It is one of my favorite meals off the shelf. It is just so tasty and so filling and warm and hearty. It's a very nice meal, and it's so great to have these whole meals on the shelf, to be able to just go and grab a jar, pour it in a pot and heat it up and know that you've got a full meal done. There's no other preparation required. And you'll have to excuse the roosters, they have all just come to chat, because that's what they do when I sit in front of a camera, as we've discussed quite a few times. So yeah. So what I've done is I've put together a video showing you how I can loaded potato soup. Now there is a recipe for this loaded potato soup. It is a Nyssa Darryl recipe, a canning diva recipe. I don't think I follow her recipe as such anymore. I did the first time I made it, I followed it pretty exact, but it wasn't really too like anything I cook. I have this tendency to do it the right way first and then do it my way post that. So we've made some adaptations, but the base of the recipe is from the Canning Diva. It was in one of her books, I think. I don't know if it's on her website, but it's in one of the books, I believe. So come along and check it out and see if you're looking for a canning project that puts a meal on the shelf. This is definitely one to give a go if you've got excess potatoes anyway. So let me bring you along to show you how I make it. Now the first thing I did was make some stock. So you're going to use a fair bit of liquid in these because it's a soup, and I always find that using stock is the best thing to use, and I much prefer fresh stock than like I do use some bouillon with water sometimes depending on what I've got available and things like that, but fresh stock is always my choice if I have the ability to do it. So what I did first was I made a batch of stock. So I pressure can my stock. I use my buffalo canner to pressure can the stock initially. So I bought a smoked hock last shopping trip purposely to make some stock with and hadn't got around to using it. So that's what I used in this. I used the smoked hock in there because I thought that that's a really good flavour to go with the loaded potato soup. As well as the chicken carcasses. So when we got the hamper, we got a couple of whole chickens, a split one and a whole roast, and I had roasted them up as a meal. So I kept all the bones and carcasses so that I could use them in a stock in the freezer after we'd eaten them as a meal. So I threw them in there as well. I put some onion, some celery, some peppercorns, garlic, salt and some apple cider vinegar. It's a very basic stock. We want it to be a fairly nice clear stock because we're using it to can the loaded potato soup. Depending on what I'm using stock for, depends on what I put in it. Sometimes I will put zucchini and sweet potato and things like that in it. It ends up a very cloudy stock but super tasty, and all the solids end up being fed to the dogs. But because I was just using this for the purposes of this soup, I wanted a fairly clear stock, so that's what I was going for. I pressure cook the stock for 90 minutes. So once it gets up to pressure, then I do it for about 90 minutes. At that point, the bones are usable for dog food. So I'll put a little clip in here and show you that not the smoked hock, that would need a lot longer than that, but for chicken bones, you can just puree them between your fingers. So what we do is we pull all the bones and all the vegetables out and we puree it in the Thermomix with a bit of the stock liquid, and then that goes as wet food for the dogs with their dry food for their meals, which is a really good way to get lots of nutrients into them as well. After it was done and had cooled a bit, I pulled the hock out so that I could strip any usable meat off it to put aside to put into the loaded potato soup as well, because I thought that would be really nice, which is partly why I'm doing it this way. Originally, I was going to make some sort of a soup out of this hock. That was the plan. It just didn't happen, and I still had the hock there, and then I wanted to make this, so it worked well. So I pulled the hock out, pulled all the meat off it that was usable. I put the hock aside because I said I can't give that to the dogs, but all the chicken bones and all the vegetables got pureed up for them. I'd prepped a whole lot of potatoes. We peeled them because they were the brush potatoes from the hamper, so they had to be peeled because you can't get them clean enough. Like, I don't have a problem with using skin on potatoes if they're washed potatoes, like they're bought washed potatoes, because the amount of times that they're washed and everything else, that doesn't worry me. I just give them a quick scrub myself and I'm okay. But brushed potatoes, you cannot get them clean enough for me to be comfortable to use them canning, because the whole point of the standards say that you shouldn't use any peel on potatoes at all, because you don't know about the germs and the microbiomes and stuff that are potentially in the dirt that's on the potatoes, which I understand, but I don't have a problem with certain potatoes with skin on, but I won't use these brushed ones. So we peeled them instead and gave them a good clean, and just stuck them in a big bowl with some lemon juice, water and lemon juice, so that they didn't brown up on me. I used the Vivor dicer for cutting them. I only tend to pull this out for really large jobs because it's a bit of a pain in the butt to clean. All those little nooks and crannies and things like that. It's not the most fun thing to clean, and it's very bulky. So if I'm only doing half a dozen potatoes or something, I just use a knife, but I've got very good knife skills too. So, it's not much of a hardship to use a knife, but for something of this size, it is wonderful. But you do have to halve the potatoes before you put them through the dicer too, because if you don't halve them, then you're going to get chip-like pieces rather than little cubes, and we're going for just little cubes because you want them to break down in the canning process, and then you want some to break down further when you reheat it, so that you've got the different textures in your soup. So you don't want those long chip fingers. If you wanted chips, then that's great. So nice big potatoes, you can have some nice big chips, though the dicing disc on this, that's probably a little large for chips, to be honest, but it does work to make chip-sized pieces instead of little cubes. So I always slice the potatoes once or twice before I put them in the dicer, and then that way I get cubes rather than rectangles. They're not rectangles, are they? A cube is a 3D square. What is a 3D rectangle? I'm having a mind blank. But anyway, chip-like pieces. So I cooked up a bunch of bacon bits that I'd cut up till they were fairly well done, and then I caramelized a bunch of onion and celery in the bacon fat. I added a little bit of my bacon salt into this because it's going to add some flavor. How far you take this is entirely up to you. Like, how caramelized you want the onions, how well cooked you want the bacon, how well cooked you want the celery and all that. It really is personal preference. I do like it to be fairly well caramelized because it's going to add lots of flavor to that soup as the soup is being pressure cooked, and I'm not a huge fan of straight onion. I definitely like it to be soft and to have that caramelly sweetened flavor to it, but that's my preference. So you can just put raw onion in here if you want, because it's going to cook in the process, but I prefer the flavor of the pre-cooked onion, and cooking it off in the bacon fat always gives you that little bit of extra zhuzh to it as well. So I mixed up the onion and celery mix with the bacon bits into a bowl and went ahead with my jar. So I'm using Fowler's 36s, which are about 1.2 litres. I put an even amount of the onion and bacon mix in the bottom of each jar, as well as some of the meat from the stock bone, and then filled them generously with the potato chunks. I put some smoked paprika and a bit of rubbed sage into each jar as well, because that's the flavours that I prefer in this soup, and then topped them up with the broth that I'd reheated. So the broth had cooled down. I'd made the broth the day before and I was canning it the next day, because that's the easiest way to do it with the broth. So I'd put the broth into a saucepan to bring it up to a simmer before adding it to the jars. So I got all the jars filled up. I debubbled it with the back end of a spatula. I cannot find my packing stick anywhere, my debubbling sticks anywhere, so I use the back end of a plastic spatula. It works fairly well. Make sure there's no big bubbles in amongst the chunks of potato. So you want to let that all settle out. You want to top the broth up if needed to maintain the headspace. You want a sort of a generous 1.5 inch headspace with these because the potatoes are raw. So they are going to suck up a lot of liquid. They're going to swell and they're going to starch up the liquid a little bit. You will find that the levels of these jars drop. Even if you don't have any siphoning, it is going to drop slightly because of that's to the nature of the soup. It wouldn't if you put less in. And a lot of these recipes, a lot of the standards with the DIY soups and things like that say that you should only have like half the jar full of solids. I've discussed it before, but I don't understand that, because if you're canning potatoes on their own, you put a jar full of potatoes. But when you add it to a soup, you're only supposed to put half the jar of potatoes. It seems a waste of jar space for me. So for me, I don't put the jars at max because everything's going to move around when it's processed if you're using raw veggies, but I definitely fill the jars generously. And then take the liquid up to the 1.5 inch, and they will still drop a little bit lower once they're processed. There will be it'll look like the volume of the jar has dropped slightly because of the change in texture of the potatoes and the moisture levels in there, which is fine. So long as your jars are over 2/3 full of liquid once they're processed, then they are safe to keep on your shelf. Obviously, the ones with more liquid in it theoretically have a longer shelf life than the ones with less liquid in it, so I tend to use the ones that have dropped capacity before the ones that are full capacity, but I don't have any problems with that, generally speaking. I cleaned all the rims really well with some white vinegar. You want to make sure you get any grease left off the rims, because we used the homemade stock and we've got the bacon in there, and you've got the hock meat in there as well. You're going to have a bit of grease floating around the whole space that you're in, so you want to make sure you white vinegar those rims really well. Now because you don't want it to interfere with the seal on the jars. Now I'm using Fowler's Vicola jars, so they have these purple rubber rings that go into a little indent around the sides of the jars, and these are the equivalent of the single-use lids that you use on a ball mason style jar. So these are the rubber pieces that go around the edge. Once I put them on, I also wipe that down with a bit of white vinegar, because my hands could have stock on them or something when I'm putting the rings on. Some people choose to put the rings on before they fill the jars. I actually probably didn't even realize that was an option the first time I made it, or sort of thought that wouldn't work because what if you get them dirty and things like that. So I have learnt to put them on afterwards. I did have some accidents initially, some very warm liquids that went everywhere, but I'm pretty comfortable doing it from this point forward, so that's how I do it. But you can put the rubber rings on before you fill the jars if that makes you more comfortable. As I said, I wipe down the rubber rings with a bit of white vinegar after I put them on there, just to make sure that no grease or oils on my hands have gotten onto the rings. Then the lids for these jars are stainless steel, and these are the reusable ones. These are like the rings on a ball mason jar. These are the reusable aspect of it. You can have single-use standard lids though that are tin. They're not a solid stainless steel, but generally speaking I only use stainless steel ones because I'm just too hard on things to use single-use stuff, to look after it. So I have stainless steel lids, and I have a large collection of them because I buy them secondhand whenever I can find them coming up. And I have some lovely viewers. Carol just recently sent me some clips and some lids that she had found. Thank you very much, Carol. So I do have some viewers who find bits and pieces of Fowler's in their cupboards or their parents' cupboards or things like that, and they send me a message and ask me if I'd like them, and I very much appreciate that. Thank you very much. So the stainless steel lids, I wipe the inside of them out with some vinegar as well, because as I said, they're washed and everything, but we live in an outdoor space, lots of dirt and dust and debris, and it just makes me feel more comfortable. So I wipe the inside of the lids as well, put them on the jars. Now I double clip my jars. I discussed this a fair bit. Fowler's doesn't actually state that their jars should be used for pressure canning. A lot of people do, including myself. I don't have a problem with it. Fowler's also state that you should only ever single clip the jars, and sticklers will say that for pressure canning as well, even though Fowler's doesn't approve of them for pressure canning. For me, I find that my lids shift too much on me, and I think that's partly just because you have to get the clips on exactly straight if you're only using one. I also have a very different size clips in my collection because everything I own is secondhand, and some of these clips are for glass lids and they're slightly different shape and size than the standard ones, and so I don't necessarily know that I'm using the exact right clips. So I double clip all my jars, and that's just my preference. Lids go on them, and then I put 4 liters of water into the canner and then put the 8 jars into the canner. So 8 is the maximum amount of jars that I can fit in the Buffalo canner. I think it's only 7 in the Presto, 8 in the Buffalo, which is awesome. So 8 of these 1.2 litre jars go in there. I checked all the seals and everything before I closed the lid, because I have been known to forget that and then go to process it and it never gets up to temperature, and then I have to start all over again, which sucks. So I do suggest checking the seal and everything before you put the lids on your canner. All the normal stuff. Once the pot was throwing steam for the full 2 minutes, so you put the lid on, you turn the pressure on, so the burner on. You don't want to take it up to absolute max straight away. Take it up to sort of medium high to get that steam going. You take it up too fast, you risk siphoning jars. So especially on something like a Camp Chef burner, because the burner is so powerful. Take it out once it's blowing steam out of the vent, then you time it for 10 minutes. Once that 10 minutes of steam is up, then you put the weight on there. And then once the weight starts to dance and jiggle on top of your pot, then you start the timer. Now, the timer, if these were quarts, because there is meat in my loaded potato soup, it would be 90 minutes. Now, there is no guidelines for canning bacon as such either, but this recipe does come from a book, which is an approved canning recipe, but it's in a book, not from the USDA. So that's personal preference, but I can bacon all the time, so that's fine. So because there's meat in it though, it needs a 90-minute canning time if it was a quart. However, these jars are a 300 ml more than a quart, so we add 20% canning time on top of that just to be safe. So these jars get processed for 108 minutes. So the timer goes for 108 minutes, which is 20% more than a quart size. And then once the 108 minutes is up, I turn the burner off and let the pressure come down to 0 before removing the weight, removing the lid, and then they go onto the bench like any other canning project, and they sit for 24 hours. And then after that 24 hours, you check the seals to make sure that they're all good. You need to be able to lift the jars up by the stainless steel lids without any movement of the lid coming off. And then once they're good, clean them. Now, these jars are definitely going to need a good clean. You will get some siphoning in these jars. It's inevitable, I find, with soups, especially soups made with your own stocks, because of the fat content of the stock. So I always need to use a bit of vinegar, warm soapy water to get these nice and clean and labeled and put on the shelf for meals. So the jars never look as nice once they're processed. These ones, they always look much better before they're processed because of the starch of the potato, and it really depends on what potato you're using as to how starchy it is. I soaked the whole potatoes in a bit of lemon juice water just to stop them going brown, but I didn't soak the diced pieces. If I had have soaked the diced pieces and rinsed them, they probably wouldn't have had as much starch, but you kind of want that starch in a soup. Like if you're canning the potatoes on their own, you might not want it starchy because it looks funny in the jar, and you get a bit of a gelatinous texture to the bottom of the jars when you're canning potatoes on their own. But in a soup, you kind of want that texture because as you're warming it up, it's going to help thicken the soup. When you serve the soup, you can use a potato masher or a immersion blender, and just you pull a few bits of the potato out and mash it all up or blend it up and then add it back into the soup, which is going to make the soup thicker as well. I have been known to do that depending on how I want the soup, whether I've got bread with it, whether I'm just eating it as is, and things like that. It's really nice with a big dollop of sour cream on it and some cheese, if you're allowed to have that. But it is just a really nice, comforting soup. It's really filling, and as I said, it's one of my favorites. And you can mix it with other soups, because a lot of the time what we do as well is when we serve a soup off the shelf, we use more than one type. So I've got a pork soup on the shelf that has a bit of tomato in it. I've got a zuppa toscana base, I don't know how that's said, the Italian sausage, potato and kale soup on the shelf that I add fresh kale to when I heat it up. And I've got smoked chicken soup and a veggie soup. And so quite a lot of the time, if the kids have soup, they'll have 2 or 3 jars in one meal because there's 6 of them. So they might pick 2 different types of soup to heat up at the same time. So I quite like to have full jars of a variety of different soups, and then you can pick and choose what you want, whether you're eating them on your own, or eating it on its own, or having it mixed. I probably should make some of this loaded potato soup in smaller jars as well, just for myself, because I would just eat it as a meal, sometimes on my own, but I would not eat 1.2 litres of it on my own, but I might eat a pint on my own. So, you know, maybe I should make some smaller jars of this up as well. It's an idea. And then that way I've got it for when I just don't feel like whatever. Or sometimes I make them meals that I don't want to eat. Like they all really like sweet potato gnocchi, which is on the menu for some time this week. And I really don't like it. So I will have something else on that day. So having the individual serves of this sort of thing would probably be nice on the shelf for my benefit as well. But the kids are allowed to heat things up for lunch too. So maybe that's individual serves of soup and stuff would be handy to have for some of the kids to choose to warm up for lunch as well. I have to have a think about that. It's more jars, which is partly why I don't do it. Like the canning it in the larger jars means less jars open if you're making a meal for everyone, but it's not always going to be for everyone, is it? So I have to have a think about that. So thank you for joining me again today. And if you are looking for a meal to put on the shelf, this is definitely one to give a go. It is one of my favorites. I really enjoy it. It heats, it's a process as well. It heats back up well. The texture is really lovely. The potato actually holds more texture than you'd think. It still is quite solid even after, you know, 108 minutes canning and then reheating and everything else. You still have the nice creamy chunks of potato in there as well, which I think is wonderful. And yes, if you add a little bit of sour cream and cheese, it's even better. So I hope you enjoyed watching, and I will see you again on the next video. Bye guys.